had always loved the quiet of the wilderness. It was the one place where I could clear my head, away from the city, the noise, the routine of daily life. I wasn't new to camping either. I had spent years going on solo trips, learning the small details that made a difference out there. How to pack light but smart, how to keep a fire going even in damp conditions, how to move through the woods without making too much noise. I trusted myself in the wild. It was late September when I took this particular trip, a time of year when the air carried the first hints of the coming cold. I had chosen a spot deep in the national forest, somewhere in Pennsylvania. The place wasn't a well-known campsite, which was exactly why I had picked it. I wanted quiet, isolation. I had looked at a few maps, found a lake about 12 miles from the nearest road, and figured that was perfect. I drove as far as I could on the dirt road before parking my truck in a clearing. From there, I loaded my pack onto my back, secured my gear, and started hiking. The first few hours were peaceful. The trails were barely visible, just faint impressions where the ground had been disturbed by deer or the occasional hiker. The deeper I went, the less I saw of any human presence. I reached the lake by late afternoon. It was even better than I had hoped. Completely untouched, surrounded by dense forest with not a single sign of anyone having been there recently. I picked a spot near the water's edge, cleared a small area for my tent, and got to work setting up camp. I had brought a compact stove, but I still gathered some wood for a fire. Even if I wasn't going to cook on it, a fire always made a campsite feel more secure at night. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky shades of red and gold. I sat by the water, listening to the wind rustling the trees, the occasional splash of a fish. This was exactly what I needed. By the time it was fully dark, the fire was going strong, crackling and sending small embers into the air. I ate a quick meal, stretched out my legs, and leaned back against a log, just taking in the night. It was colder now, but my jacket and the fire kept me warm. Everything was perfect, until I noticed something. The woods had gone quiet. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know how unnatural that is. Even at night, there's always something. A distant owl, the rustling of small creatures, the shifting of branches in the wind. But now there was nothing. The air was completely still. I sat up, suddenly alert. My eyes scanned the tree line, but in the firelight, all I could see were the dark silhouettes of trees stretching toward the sky. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it into the woods. Nothing. I listened for a long time, but the silence didn't break. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the way it sometimes does when you're alone in the dark. I tossed a few more logs on the fire, then crawled into my tent. It took me a while to fall asleep, but at some point, exhaustion took over. I woke up suddenly. Something had snapped outside my tent. I wasn't groggy. I was fully alert, my heart already pounding. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly as I listened. Another sound, a faint crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My tent was zipped shut, but I could see the glow of the fire through the fabric. The flames had died down, leaving only a dim light flickering outside. Then I heard it, a low, deliberate exhale. Not an animal, person. Every muscle in my body tensed. I carefully shifted, reaching for my flashlight. My mind was racing. Who would be out here? This was miles from any trail, and I hadn't seen a single person since leaving my truck. I clicked the flashlight on, aiming it at the tent wall. The thin fabric glowed, but I didn't see a shadow. Whoever was out there was standing just outside the fire's reach. I took a slow, deep breath, then unzipped the tent in one quick motion. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. Nothing. The fire cast long shadows, but there was no one in sight. I stepped out, knife still in my other hand. The forest stretched around me, dark and silent. I scanned the ground, no fresh footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. But I knew what I had heard. For the next hour, I sat by the fire, knife on my lap, flashlight in hand. The silence stretched on, unbroken. Eventually, exhaustion started creeping in again. I didn't want to go back into the tent, but I also couldn't stay up all night. I let the fire burn low, then forced myself to lie down. I kept the knife within reach. Sleep didn't come easy, but at some point my body gave in. Morning came slow. The first light seeped through the trees, and I sat up, my body sore from tension. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more familiar, but I still felt uneasy. I stepped out of my tent and froze. There, in the dirt near the fire pit, were footprints, barefoot, human. They circled my campsite, stopping just outside my tent. I felt my stomach drop. Whoever had been out there last night had stood just inches away from me, listening, watching. I packed up immediately. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move fast. I wasn't going to stick around. By the time the sun was fully up, I had my gear strapped to my back, and I was hiking out. I didn't stop, didn't take any breaks. I just moved, fast and steady, my knife still in my hand the whole way. It took me hours, but eventually, I made it back to my truck. I threw my pack into the bed, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on paved roads with other cars around me. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know how long they had been watching me before I woke up. I never went back to that spot. It was late September, and the days were getting shorter. The crisp air of early autumn clung to the mountains, and the scent of damp earth mixed with the faint smoke from a campfire. I had been planning this trip for weeks. A solo camping trip deep in the Oregon wilderness, far from the noise of the city, away from work, away from everything. I had always been comfortable in the woods. Growing up, my father took me hunting and camping every fall. He taught me how to track, how to read the land, how to move quietly, and how to listen. The forest had always felt safe to me, but this time something felt off from the start. I had chosen a remote spot near an old logging road, a good 15 miles from the nearest town. The drive-in was rough, the dirt road winding through dense pine and fir trees, climbing higher into the mountains. The last stretch of the road was barely maintained, with deep ruts and overgrown brush scraping the sides of my truck. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, perfect for setting up camp. I stepped out, stretched, and took a deep breath. The air was cold and damp, the way it always was before the first real snowfall. I started setting up camp, pitching my tent close to the tree line for wind protection. The ground was covered in fallen leaves and pine needles, damp but not soaked. After gathering firewood and setting up my small stove, I sat by the fire, eating a can of beans and watching the trees sway in the wind. That's when I noticed the silence. I'd been in the woods enough to know how they sounded. The distant rustling of squirrels, the occasional bird call, the creaking of branches. It was never truly silent. But now there was nothing. No wind, no movement, no sound at all except the soft crackling of my fire. I listened harder, trying to pick up any signs of life. But the only sound was my own breathing. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, the kind that set off something deep and instinctual in your brain, telling you that something wasn't right. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I was just overthinking it. I finished my food, doused the fire, and climbed into my tent, zipping the flap tight. The cold seeped into my sleeping bag, and I pulled it tighter around me. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but something kept me awake, a nagging feeling, like I was being watched. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. A noise woke me, a soft shuffling sound, just outside my tent. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. It wasn't the sound of a small animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was something larger, moving carefully, deliberate. I held my breath. Then I heard it again, a low, guttural breathing, slow, steady, right outside my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The breathing was too close, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I could hear the faint sound of something shifting its weight, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence returned. I waited, muscles tense, every nerve on edge. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Finally, I forced myself to relax, though my heart was still hammering in my chest. Maybe it had been a deer or a coyote. Maybe I was just on edge because of the unnatural silence earlier. I closed my eyes, gripping the knife under my sleeping bag, and eventually, sleep took me. The next morning, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The air was still, but the forest had come back to life. Birds chirped in the distance, and a squirrel darted up a nearby tree. I looked around, searching for any signs of what had been outside my tent. First, I saw nothing. Then, a few feet away, I noticed something strange. Prints in the dirt. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't from an animal, at least not one I'd ever seen. They were long, almost human, but with claw-like indentations at the tips of each toe. They trailed around my tent, stopping right outside where my head had been. A shiver ran down my spine. I crouched, examining them closer. The prints were deep, heavier than a normal footprint, as if whatever made them had been crouching, pressing down into the earth. Something had been watching me. I packed up my camp faster than I ever had before. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I wasn't alone. I threw my gear into the truck, slammed the door shut, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I backed out onto the dirt road, tires spinning in the soft earth. As I drove, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something step out of the tree line. But there was nothing. Just before I reached the main road, I spotted something in the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long arms and legs. Its skin was pale, almost gray, blending into the misty morning light. I couldn't see its face. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I pressed the gas pedal down, speeding onto the paved road, not looking back. I never went back to that spot. I never told anyone what happened. But I know what I saw. And I know that thing, whatever it was watching me, waiting, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. I was never a fan of camping alone, but I had done it a few times before without trouble. I always chose familiar spots, places where I had camped before, where I knew the layout of the land and could trust my instincts. This time was different. I decided to go further than I usually would, deeper into the woods just to challenge myself. I wanted to disconnect from everything for a while, to clear my head. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me and nature. I picked a remote spot, miles from the nearest town. I parked my truck at the trailhead, packed my gear, and started hiking. The trail was rough, not well maintained, but I liked that. It meant fewer people came this way. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt, the occasional rustling of leaves, and the wind pushing through the trees. It took me a few hours to reach the clearing where I planned to set up camp. The spot was perfect, flat ground, a small creek nearby for water, and enough trees around to block the wind. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and made a small fire before the sun went down. It was peaceful, the kind of silence you only get when you're deep in the wilderness, away from everything. As the night settled in, I sat by the fire, ate my food, and let my mind wander. The woods had a way of making you feel like you were the only person left in the world. That's what I liked about it. But there was always that feeling in the back of my mind, that small, nagging thought that I wasn't actually alone. I heard movement in the distance. Not unusual. Animals were always out at night. It sounded like something walking through the brush. A deer, maybe. I didn't think much of it. But as the night went on, the sounds got closer. At first, it was sporadic, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Then it became more deliberate, like someone or something was moving with purpose. I shone my flashlight into the trees but saw nothing. The sounds stopped as soon as I did. That's when the unease set in. I had spent enough time outdoors to know the difference between normal animal sounds and something else. This wasn't normal. It felt off. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness. I told myself it was just a deer, a curious raccoon, something harmless. But then I noticed something strange. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of insects and birds, had gone completely silent. It's something I had only experienced a few times before, and it always meant one thing: something was nearby. Something big enough or dangerous enough to make everything else go still. I listened carefully, barely breathing, and then I heard it. A long, slow exhale. Not from me, not from an animal. It was close. I didn't move. I didn't even turn my head. I just stared into the darkness, my mind racing. My gun was inside the tent. I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. My knife was on my belt, but that wouldn't do much if something really wanted to hurt me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The woods came back to life. The insects chirped again. The wind rustled the leaves. Whatever it was gone. At least I hoped it was. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, gripping my knife, listening. I waited for the sun to rise. When it did, I packed up my things and decided to cut the trip short. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to meet it. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. I felt watched. I didn't know if it was just paranoia or if something was actually following me. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. Then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't see details, just the shape of a person, half hidden in the shadows. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I started the truck and drove, fast. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by houses and streetlights. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing: I won't be going back to that place. Ever. It was the middle of summer when I made the mistake of setting up camp near an old, forgotten graveyard. I had been hiking for days, moving deeper into the countryside, avoiding crowded trails and sticking to back roads and forgotten paths. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I had been dealing with a lot back home. Stress from work, the slow unraveling of friendships, and a nagging emptiness that I couldn't shake. So, I packed up my gear and set out alone, figuring some time in nature would clear my head. I didn't plan to sleep in a graveyard. That was never the goal. But as the sun started to dip behind the trees that evening, I realized I had misjudged my timing. I had spent too much time moving at a slow pace, taking in the quiet, and now I was running out of daylight. My map showed no official campsites nearby, and the nearest town was miles away. I needed to find a spot soon. I was walking along a dirt road when I spotted the entrance. It wasn't marked by any sign, just an old iron gate, rusted and leaning to one side, barely hanging onto the stone posts that framed it. Beyond the gate, there was a clearing, and at the far end, I could make out rows of crooked headstones, some standing tall, others leaning at odd angles. The graveyard was small, maybe only 100 yards across, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The place looked abandoned, untouched by time except for the slow decay of stone and wood. There were no fresh flowers, no signs of recent visitors, just silence. It wasn't ideal, but it was flat ground, and it meant I wouldn't have to push further into the woods in the dark. I told myself it was just another clearing, just another piece of land like any other. The fact that it happened to hold old graves didn't matter. The dead didn't bother me. I climbed through the broken gate and walked to the far side of the clearing, where the ground was mostly clear of debris. I set my pack down and began setting up my tent. The fabric rustled loudly in the stillness. My movements felt exaggerated in the quiet, like I was disturbing something that had been left untouched for too long. Once my tent was up, I gathered some wood and built a small fire. The flames flickered weakly at first before catching properly, throwing light across the overgrown grass. The heat was a comfort, a reminder that I was still here, still part of the living world. I ate a quick meal, some dried meat and a few granola bars, then leaned back against my pack, staring up at the sky. The stars were sharp, undisturbed by city lights. The night air was still, with only the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. For a while, I felt at peace. The stress that had been eating at me back home seemed distant, unimportant. Then the feeling changed. At first, it was subtle, a creeping unease, a slight shift in the air, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I ignored it, chalking it up to my own nerves. It was just the setting getting to me, nothing more. But then I noticed the sounds, or rather, the lack of them. The wind had stopped completely. The trees no longer swayed. The usual night sounds, the chirp of insects, the distant call of an owl had gone silent. The air felt heavy, pressing in around me. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself to sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, leaving only a small opening for ventilation. The fabric of the tent felt thin, barely a barrier between me and the world outside. I lay on my back, listening. Something moved outside. It wasn't loud, just the faintest rustling, like grass being disturbed. It could have been anything, a small animal, a bird shifting in the trees. I held my breath and listened harder. The sound stopped. Then, a moment later, it came again, closer. Not an animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, too measured. They weren't coming from the trees. They were moving through the graveyard. I stayed still, barely breathing. My fingers tightened around the knife I kept by my side. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I waited, every muscle locked in place. Nothing happened. Minutes passed, then more. The weight in the air lifted slightly. The night sounds slowly returned, the whisper of wind, the hum of insects. I didn't move. I barely slept. Morning came slowly. The first light of dawn was weak, casting long shadows through the trees. I unzipped my tent carefully, scanning the area outside. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone had been near my tent. But as I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had overstayed my welcome. The graveyard felt different in the daylight, but the unease remained. I moved quickly, rolling up my sleeping bag, stuffing my gear into my pack. As I turned to leave, my eyes caught something near one of the older graves. A single boot print in the dirt. Too fresh, too deep. I didn't stay to examine it. I threw my pack over my shoulder and walked out through the broken gate. not stopping until I was miles away. I never camped near a graveyard again, and I never hiked alone after that. I've always liked being alone in nature. It's something about the quiet, the distance from the world, and the sense of being away from everything that makes camping one of my favorite things to do. I never cared much for busy campsites or places filled with people. I always preferred the isolated spots, the ones where you wouldn't hear another person for miles. It was late September when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. The summer warmth had faded, but the cold hadn't fully set in yet. It was the kind of weather where you needed a jacket at night but could get away with just a long-sleeved shirt during the day. I had planned to camp in a small wooded area in the Peak District, far from any towns or main roads. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, some food, and a few essentials. The plan was to spend a couple of nights there, just relaxing, hiking a bit, and enjoying the quiet. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I wasn't expecting to find a body. The first day was normal. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my car a couple of miles from the area I had planned to camp in, and hiked in with my gear. The trees were tall and thick, the kind that blocked out most of the sky when you looked up. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and moss. I found a spot near a small clearing, just off a narrow dirt trail that seemed barely used. It was perfect, flat ground, a few fallen logs nearby for firewood, and no signs of anyone else around. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the sounds of the forest. Birds, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. It was peaceful. That night, the temperature dropped more than I expected. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up my tent, and tried to get comfortable. The forest felt different at night. The sounds seemed sharper, closer, but I wasn't worried. I had camped alone many times before, and the noises of the wild never bothered me. What did bother me, though, was the smell. At first, I thought it was just the damp earth, maybe rotting leaves or something nearby, but it was strong, too strong. It had a thickness to it, like something heavy in the air, a mix of dampness and decay. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just an animal that had died somewhere deeper in the woods. But the smell was there, clinging to the air, even as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire had died out during the night, and the forest was covered in a thin layer of mist. I stretched, made some instant coffee on my small stove, and decided to explore a bit before breakfast. I hadn't gone more than 10 minutes from my campsite when I saw something unusual. The trees in this part of the woods were close together, their trunks thick and covered in patches of moss. The ground was uneven, with roots twisting up from the soil like veins. But in the middle of it all, just beyond a fallen tree, I spotted something that didn't belong. A shape. At first, I thought it was a pile of old clothes, maybe something a hiker had left behind. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a body. The smell hit me first, worse than it had been the night before. It was overwhelming, the kind that makes your stomach turn. The body was lying face down, partially covered by leaves and dirt. The clothes were dark, torn in places, stained with mud and something else. The arms were twisted at odd angles, like they had been broken. I stopped a few feet away, my heart pounding. I didn't want to get any closer, but my eyes kept scanning over it, taking in the details. The skin was pale, almost gray. The hair was matted, stuck to the scalp with dried blood. I didn't know how long it had been there, but it wasn't fresh. My first thought was to turn around, get out of the woods and call the police. But I had no signal. I had deliberately chosen a spot far from any roads, and now that decision didn't seem so smart. I forced myself to think logically. If I followed the trail back to my car, I could drive until I found a signal and call for help. It was the only option. I took one last look at the body, then turned and started walking back toward my campsite. My pace was quicker now, my breath uneven. I tried not to think about it, but my mind kept circling back. Who was he? How did he die? How long had he been out here? And then a worse thought crept in. Was someone else out here with me? As I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees felt taller, the shadows longer. Every small sound made my pulse jump. A twig snapping, a bird flapping its wings, my own footsteps crunching against the dirt. I told myself I was being paranoid, but paranoia or not, I wasn't staying another night. I shouldered my pack, doused the fire, and started hiking back toward my car. But then I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. I stopped cold, staring at them. The ground was damp, soft enough to leave clear impressions. These prints were fresh, deep, with edges still sharp. They led from the direction of the body, cutting across the path I had just walked. Whoever had left them had passed through here recently. Very recently. I didn't run, but I walked as fast as I could without making too much noise. My breath was sharp, my ears straining for any sound behind me. The woods felt different now, like they were pressing in, the trees closer together, the path longer than I remembered. When I finally saw my car, relief hit me like a wave. I yanked the door open, threw my pack inside, and started the engine. The sound of the motor felt too loud, echoing through the trees. I didn't waste time. I drove. Fast. I didn't stop until I had signal, until I could call the police. When they arrived, I led them back to where I had found the body. They marked off the area, examined the scene. But when they turned the body over, the look on the officer's face told me something was wrong. This wasn't an accident, he said. There were wounds on the man's chest, deep ones, like he had been stabbed again and again, and then left here alone to rot. I answered all their questions. They asked when I had arrived, if I had seen anyone else, if I had heard anything strange. But I hadn't, not until I had found the body, and not until I had seen those footprints. I never found out who he was, or why he had been killed. The police never told me if they found the person who did it. But for weeks after, I kept thinking about those footprints. They hadn't led away from the body. They had led toward my campsite. Whoever had killed that man had still been out there, and they had been watching me. I never went back to that spot, and I never camped alone again. I had always wanted to experience the Amazon in its rawest form. Not a guided tour, not a short jungle trek with a group, but real, deep, isolated camping. I wasn't reckless. I had years of experience with the wilderness, long hikes, solo camping in national parks, and even some survival training. But nothing could fully prepare me for the way the Amazon felt at night. The rain had been falling steadily since late afternoon. Thick, heavy drops slammed against the canopy above, breaking into smaller streams before soaking the jungle floor. I had found a relatively dry patch under a few towering trees, not far from a slow-moving river. The thick humidity made everything stick to my skin. The mosquitoes were relentless, even with repellent. I had set up my tent quickly, my hands moving from memory. It was a good tent, strong, waterproof, reliable. Still, the weight of the jungle around me made me uneasy. The Amazon wasn't like any other place I'd camped before. It felt alive in a way I couldn't quite explain. By the time darkness settled, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. The sound was deafening, but beneath it was an orchestra of noises I had never heard before. Chirps, growls, the distant scream of something deep in the forest. I sat inside my tent, eating a protein bar, my gear stacked neatly. My machete rested beside me, along with a flashlight and a backup battery. I didn't take any chances. I wasn't afraid, but I was on edge. The jungle was unpredictable. I had read stories of jaguars stalking camps, of snakes slipping into tents, of insects with bites that could take a man down in hours. I had planned for all of that, prepared myself mentally. But what I hadn't accounted for was the overwhelming sense of being watched. It started as a feeling, a pressure in my chest, a crawling sensation at the back of my neck. I forced myself to ignore it. Fear had no place here. I reminded myself that the jungle had its own rhythm, its own way of existing. I was just a visitor. Then something changed. A new sound, separate from the rain, separate from the hum of insects. A wet, heavy movement, close, too close. I froze, listening. It wasn't the rustling of a small animal. It was slow, deliberate, something moving through the undergrowth. My heart pounded. I reached for my machete. I strained my ears, waiting. The movement stopped. Silence except for the rain. I took a slow breath, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. An animal, maybe a tapir or a large rodent. Nothing to worry about. But I knew better. I had spent enough nights alone in the wild to recognize the difference between an animal passing through and something paying attention. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing but thick foliage, slick with rain. The jungle swallowed light, making it hard to see past a few feet. I waited, but the noise didn't return. Hours passed. The rain continued. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something just beyond the reach of my tent. I told myself it was paranoia. I told myself it was the Amazon playing tricks on me. Then I heard the breath. It was soft, almost hidden beneath the rain. But I knew what it was. It wasn't the short, erratic breaths of an animal. It was controlled, quiet, the kind of breathing a person makes when they don't want to be heard. I gripped my machete so tightly my hand ached. My mind raced. No one was supposed to be out here. I was miles from any village, deep in the jungle. I had made sure of that. I waited, forcing myself to stay still. The breath came again, closer this time. My tent was zipped shut, but I felt exposed, as if the fabric between me and the outside world was nothing more than a thin layer of false security. And then the worst sound of all, the zipper. It was faint, barely a shift, but unmistakable. Someone, something, had touched the entrance of my tent. I didn't hesitate. With one quick motion, I slashed outward with my machete, aiming at the sound. The blade sliced through fabric and met nothing but empty air. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam in every direction. Rain pounded against my skin. My breath came fast and shallow. Nothing, just jungle. But I knew something had been there. The rest of the night was a blur. I sat outside, machete in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting for something to return. But nothing did. The rain eventually let up, and the jungle returned to its usual chorus of sounds. But I never shook the feeling that something had been watching me. Something had tested the barrier between us. At first light, I packed up my camp and left. I didn't think. I just moved. The hike back to the nearest village was long, but I didn't stop. Every rustling leaf, every shift in the trees sent adrenaline through my veins. I didn't look back until I saw the first signs of human presence. Boats along the riverbank, the distant sound of voices. I never found out who or what had been there that night. Maybe it was a poacher, maybe a lost traveler, maybe something else. All I knew was that I had never felt fear like that before. The Amazon was wild, untamed. It was a place where humans didn't belong, and I wasn't about to test my luck a second time. I left and never returned. I don't go hunting much anymore. I used to, though. Spent whole weeks in the woods when I was younger. I liked being alone out there, just me, my rifle, and the quiet. There was something about the way the world slowed down when you were tracking something. Every sound, every movement, every shift in the wind became part of the hunt. But that was years ago. I don't go anymore, and it's because of what happened in that valley. It was late October years back. The air had that first real bite of winter in it, sharp enough to remind you that the season was changing. I had taken a few days off work, figured I'd head out to the woods and see if I could bring back some deer meat before the weather got too cold. I packed up my truck, double-checked my rifle, and drove out toward the mountains, heading for a spot I hadn't been to in a while. An old valley deep in the forest, far enough away that I wouldn't run into other hunters. I liked that about it. I didn't want to run into anyone. Hunting was something I did alone. The drive took most of the day, winding down gravel roads, past logging sites and empty fields, until finally, I reached the turnoff that led into the woods. From there, it was another hour on an old dirt trail, barely more than tire ruts cutting through the trees. The further I went, the rougher the road got, branches scraping against the sides of my truck, the ground uneven beneath the tires. Eventually, I reached a clearing where I always set up camp. I got out, stretched, and breathed in the cold air. It smelled like damp earth and pine. The sun was already low in the sky, painting everything in deep orange. I set up my tent, built a fire, and got my gear ready for the next day. I was planning to be out at dawn. That night, as I sat by the fire, I noticed how quiet it was. That wasn't too unusual. These deep parts of the forest got eerily silent sometimes, especially at night. No wind, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the usual distant hoot of an owl. Just silence. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too focused on my plans for the morning. I woke before sunrise, had a quick breakfast, and grabbed my rifle. The ground was covered in frost, crunching under my boots as I made my way into the trees. My breath came in white clouds. I spent the first few hours tracking. I found fresh deer sign near a narrow stream, followed it for a while, but lost the trail in a rocky area. I kept moving, checking ridges and valleys, keeping an eye out for movement. By midday, I had covered a lot of ground but hadn't seen a single animal. That was strange. This place was usually full of life. Squirrels, birds, the occasional coyote passing through. But the woods felt empty. I kept hunting. I wasn't about to head back empty-handed. By late afternoon, I finally saw something. I was moving along a ridge when I spotted a deer in the valley below. A big buck standing still among the trees. He was just standing there, not moving, his head held high like he was sniffing the air. He was too far to get a clean shot, so I started down the ridge, moving slow, careful not to make any noise. The buck didn't move. I got within range, raised my rifle, and steadied my aim. Then, right as I was about to pull the trigger, he bolted. Not away from me, but straight ahead, deeper into the valley. That didn't make sense. He hadn't seen me. He hadn't smelled me. I was downwind. It was like something ahead had scared him. I hesitated, looked around, listened. Nothing. I decided to follow. I don't know why, I just did. I moved slowly, watching for any sign of him. I found tracks in the damp earth, followed them for a while, deeper into the trees. Then I saw something that made me stop. The tracks ended, just stopped. There was no sign of struggle, no disturbed earth like he had jumped or kicked up dirt, just tracks that led into nothing. That didn't make sense. I stood there for a long time, looking around, scanning the trees. The silence was heavier now, pressing in on me. My instincts told me something wasn't right. I turned back. I made it a few steps before I noticed something else. Another set of tracks. Not deer, human, barefoot. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the mud. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. They came from the trees and stopped right near where the deer's tracks had ended. I felt my stomach drop. I listened, held my breath. Nothing. I left. I didn't run, but I moved fast. I kept my rifle up, my eyes scanning the trees, my ears straining for any sound. I made it back to camp just as the sun was setting. I didn't stay. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my truck. I didn't bother with the fire. I just wanted to get out. The drive back was slow. The trail was rough and I had to take it easy. My hands were tight on the wheel, my rifle sitting in the passenger seat. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something behind me. I didn't. I made it home late that night, sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time, just sitting there, trying to understand what had happened. I never could. A few days later, I looked up the area. No hunting reports, no missing hikers, no strange sightings, just empty woods. I never went back, and I don't hunt anymore.